The village of Nkwanta sat nestled in the valley between two rolling hills, where the golden rays of the setting sun bathed the earth in warm, honeyed hues. The air was thick with the scent of earth and the sweet fragrance of wildflowers, carried by the gentle winds that rustled the tall grasses. Life in Nkwanta moved at a slower pace, where tradition and community bound the people together in a tight-knit embrace. The villagers, dressed in brightly coloured cloth and adorned in handmade jewellery, went about their daily routines, weaving baskets, tending to livestock, and preparing food over open fires. Children played in the dirt, laughing and chasing each other, while the elders sat beneath the shade of tall baobab trees, exchanging stories and wisdom passed down through generations. In this quiet, modest village, everything had its place. The rhythms of life were guided by the seasons, and every event, from the planting of crops to the celebration of marriages, was dictated by custom. The people of Nkwanta had lived this way for centuries, holding fast to traditions that ensured harmony and order. But beneath the surface of this idyllic existence, there were unspoken rules, expectations, and pressures, especially for the young women of the village. Amina, a young woman in her early 20s, had always felt the weight of these pressures more acutely than others. With her bright eyes and warm smile, she was admired by all who knew her. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was her quiet strength and resilience that truly set her apart. Yet, behind her calm demeanour, Amina carried a burden that she could not escape. Her stepmother, Mariam, was the force that controlled her life. Mariam was a woman of power, known for her stern demeanour and unwavering authority. She ruled their household with an iron fist, and no decision was made without her approval. Mariam had married Amina's father many years ago, and ever since then, she had taken the reins of the family, ensuring that everything, from finances to social standing, was meticulously managed. While Amina's father was a kind man, he was often silent in the face of his wife's dominance, leaving Amina to bear the brunt of Mariam's unrelenting demands. Amina had always known that her future had been decided for her. Her stepmother had made it clear from the time she was a child that she would marry well, aligning herself with the most prosperous man in the village to secure her place in society. It wasn't enough that Amina was beautiful. It wasn't enough that she was kind and hard-working. Mariam's only concern was the wealth and social status of her future husband. So, when Amina turned 20, Mariam began her relentless push for an arranged marriage to Kofi, the wealthy son of a neighbouring village, a man who owned land, cattle, and a successful trading business. To Mariam, the marriage was a perfect match, a means to elevate their social standing and bring more wealth into their home. To Amina, it felt like a prison. She had seen Kofi only once, and the brief encounter had left her with a sense of unease. He was kind enough in appearance, but his cold, calculating eyes made her feel as if she were little more than a commodity, something to be traded for a better life. Amina knew that this marriage, while financially promising, would leave her heart empty and her spirit stifled. She would be expected to fit into a mould that she had never agreed to. But Amina had no choice. In her world, a woman's desires were secondary to her family's ambitions. She could only hope that someday fate would allow her to choose her own path. Amina's life had always been defined by the expectations of others. Her stepmother, Mariam, had spent years shaping her into the perfect bride for a wealthy man, and Amina had come to believe that this was her only future. The thought of spending her life with Kofi, the man chosen by Mariam, filled her with dread. The idea of being married to someone she hardly knew, someone who seemed more interested in his social status than her happiness, weighed heavily on her heart. But then, one fateful afternoon, everything changed. It was a hot, dusty day, and Amina had gone to the village market to fetch some vegetables for dinner. She moved through the crowd, her mind preoccupied with the looming wedding preparations that her stepmother insisted on. As she passed a stall selling dried fish, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, miss, do you have the time?" Amina turned to find a man standing behind her. He was dressed simply, in a faded shirt and trousers that had clearly seen better days. His skin was dark, like polished mahogany, and his eyes were warm, like the earth after a long rain. He smiled gently, and in that moment, Amina felt an inexplicable pull in her chest. "It's nearly noon," Amina replied, surprised by the softness in her voice. "Thank you," the man said, offering a small bow of respect. "I was just passing through. I'm Kwame, by the way." Amina nodded, her gaze lingering on his face. There was something in his eyes, something that made her feel seen, not just as a future wife to a rich man, but as a person in her own right. "I'm Amina," she said, and for the first time in a long while, she smiled. Their conversation was brief, but in those few minutes, Amina felt an unspoken connection with Kwame that she had never felt with anyone else. He spoke with a humble dignity, a quiet strength that made her feel at ease. It was clear that he wasn't wealthy, not by any stretch of the imagination, but there was an honesty in him that made him seem richer than the wealthiest man in the village. Kwame wasn't the man Mariam had chosen for her. He was different, humble, hard-working, and deeply kind. Over the next few days, Amina and Kwame continued to cross paths in the village, and each meeting deepened the bond between them. They talked at the market, exchanged pleasantries as they passed one another on the dirt roads, and began to share small moments of their lives. Aminina was drawn to Kwame's simplicity and his view of the world. He didn't care about wealth or social status. He cared about hard work, loyalty, and love. For the first time in her life, Amina felt like she could be herself around someone. She didn't have to pretend to be the perfect bride. With Kwame, she could simply be Amina. As the days passed, their connection grew stronger. Amina knew, deep in her heart, that Kwame was the one she wanted to spend her life with. Not the rich suitor her stepmother had chosen, but she also knew the consequences of defying Mariam's plans. Her life, her choices, her future were all controlled by Mariam's iron grip. To marry Kwame would be to go against everything she had been taught, everything the village expected from her. And yet, Amina couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. Her heart longed for something real, something pure. It wasn't wealth or luxury that she wanted, it was freedom. And she had come to realize that the only way to claim that freedom was to follow her heart. The decision was not an easy one. Amina knew that defying her stepmother would bring consequences, harsh ones. Mariam had already made it clear that Amina's future was to be secured through a marriage to a wealthy man, and any deviation from that plan would be seen as a betrayal. But the more Amina thought about it, the more she knew that she could not live a life dictated by someone else's desires. She'd already spent too many years in Mariam's shadow, and now, with Kwame, she finally saw a way out, a way to live for herself. One moonless night, when the village was quiet and the stars were hidden behind a veil of clouds, Amina and Kwame met secretly in the clearing by the river. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, and the only sound was the soft rustling of the trees above them. "Are you sure about this?" Kwame asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Amina looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." With no priest, no ceremony, and no family to witness, they exchanged vows under the watchful eyes of the stars. The river, silent and steady, flowed beside them, its waters as deep and endless as the love they shared. It was a simple ceremony, but to Amina, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever experienced. They were married now, bound by love, not by social status or family expectations. In that moment, Amina felt free, unburdened by the weight of her stepmother's control. For the first time, she was in charge of her own destiny. The days following the wedding were a whirlwind of emotion. Amina and Kwame's secret life began. They moved quietly through the village, careful not to draw attention to themselves. Amina continued to fulfill her duties at home, but in her heart, she carried the secret of her marriage with Kwame. At night, she would slip away to their hidden spot by the river, where she and Kwame could be together without fear of discovery. Their time together was precious, and every moment felt like a stolen treasure. Amina's heart swelled with happiness every time she saw him, and the simple joys of their life together, sitting under the stars, sharing a meal of bread and vegetables, talking about their dreams for the future, were more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined. Amina knew that her stepmother would never approve of her marriage to Kwame. Mariam had already set her sights on a wealthy suitor for Amina, and she had no intention of allowing her to marry a poor man. But as the days passed, Mariam remained oblivious to the truth. She continued to make grand plans for Amina's future, convinced that her daughter would fall in line with her wishes. Amina's life, though simple, was filled with a joy she had never known. She had found love, and with it, a sense of freedom that she could never have imagined. And as long as Mariam remained unaware, Amina and Kwame's secret life would continue, a life that belonged only to them, free from the expectations and constraints of the world around them. But Amina knew that the peace they had found would not last forever. Sooner or later, the truth would come to light, and their world would change forever. Amina's life had become an intricate web of secrecy and duty. Each day she woke up to the harsh light of her stepmother's expectations, but her heart belonged to the quiet hours spent with Kwame, hidden away from the prying eyes of the village. Her routine had become a balancing act. On one side, the weight of her obligations to Mariam, and on the other, the secret joy of being married to a man she loved deeply. Each morning, she performed her duties at home, fetching water from the well, preparing meals, and tidying the house. But as she worked, her mind was elsewhere. She thought of Kwame, of their stolen moments together. He would sometimes send her little tokens, a dried flower, a hand-carved wooden bracelet, small gifts that held immense meaning. Each item reminded her that she was not just a dutiful daughter, but a woman who had chosen love over obligation. But these moments were fleeting. Amina had to be careful. She had learned to walk quietly, speak softly, and avoid eye contact with her stepmother when Mariam asked about her day. She had become a master of evasion, pretending to be the dutiful daughter who was preparing for her marriage to the wealthy suitor Mariam had chosen. But inside, Amina was at war with herself. She loved Kwame with all her heart, but society told her that love could not stand in the way of wealth and status. Mariam had made it clear that Amina's marriage to Kofi was the best way to secure their future, and her insistence on this union was suffocating. The days turned into weeks, and as Amina's love for Kwame grew deeper, so did the weight of the secret she carried. They could no longer meet in the open. Their encounters had to be brief, often in the quiet spaces of the forest or by the river, where no one would see them. These secret meetings filled Amina's heart with a mix of longing and guilt. She loved Kwame more than she had ever loved anyone, but she could not ignore the pressures of her family and the community. At night, when the moon was high in the sky and the house was quiet, Amina would lie in bed, her heart racing. She could hear the faint sounds of the village at rest, the crackling of distant fires, the whispers of the wind. She would think about her future with Kwame, or the future that Mariam had planned for her with Kofi. The conflict tore at her, and for the first time, Amina began to feel a deep sadness. She had chosen love, but was love enough to survive in a world so focused on wealth and status? Mariam, meanwhile, was becoming more persistent. Each day she spoke more eagerly about the upcoming marriage arrangements with Kofi. She pushed Amina to accept the proposal, reminding her that this was an opportunity that could change their lives for the better. Mariam painted a picture of a life filled with luxury, large houses, fine clothing, and an elevated status within the village. Amina's refusal to embrace this dream seemed to frustrate her stepmother more and more. Though she couldn't understand the reason behind it, the tension in their home grew palpable. Mariam would criticize Amina for being distant, accusing her of being moody and ungrateful for the opportunities being presented to her. She could not understand why Amina would resist such a perfect match, especially when it could lift their family out of poverty and into wealth. Amina, on the other hand, was fighting to preserve the only thing that truly mattered to her, her love for Kwame. But every day the pressure mounted. Mariam's persistence, her forceful plans for Amina's future, felt like chains tightening around her heart. As the days passed, the strain began to show. Amina's interactions with Kwame became more rushed, less intimate. They could no longer share the quiet moments by the river, the place where they had first pledged their vows. It was too dangerous. Instead, their meetings were secret, hidden in the shadows of the night. They would pass each other fleetingly in the market or along the road, exchanging a few stolen words before quickly parting ways, their hearts aching for the closeness they once had. Amina felt herself changing. The joy she'd once felt when she saw Kwame began to be tainted by guilt. She was lying to her stepmother, to her family, to the village. The weight of her deception bore down on her, but her love for Kwame remained steadfast. The more she tried to reconcile her secret marriage with the life her stepmother wanted for her, the more she realized that something had to give. She couldn't keep living this double life. The longer she stayed hidden, the harder it became to breathe. Kwame noticed the change in her. He could see the strain in her eyes when they met. He could feel the distance growing between them, and it broke his heart. Amina's internal conflict was taking its toll on her, and the more they had to hide their love, the more their relationship felt fragile. Yet, Kwame refused to give up on her. He would remind her that their love was worth any sacrifice, that no matter what the world thought, they had each other. But even he, with all his love for her, knew that the pressure Amina faced from her stepmother was immense. One evening, when Amina and Kwame met by the river once more, the weight of the situation finally came crashing down. "I can't keep doing this," Amina whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "The secrets, the lies. I feel like I'm losing myself." Kwame took her hands in his heart aching for her pain. "We will find a way," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "We'll face whatever comes, together. You are not alone in this." But as Amina looked into his eyes, the doubt that had been creeping into her heart threatened to consume her. She didn't know how long she could continue living in secrecy, torn between the love she had for Kwame and the expectations of her family and society. The future she had dreamed of, one built on love and mutual respect, now felt like an impossible dream, a dream that was slipping further and further away with each passing day. The growing tension between Amina's secret marriage and her stepmother's relentless plans seemed destined to break, but Amina didn't know how much longer she could hold everything together. Every glance at Kwame, every whispered promise, reminded her of what she stood to lose. But would it be enough to change the course of her life? Would love be enough to defy the societal pressures that threatened to tear them apart? As the days grew longer and the pressure continued to mount, Amina realized that she was approaching a crossroads. Her heart longed for a life with Kwame, a life built on love, but her mind screamed that such a life was impossible in a world that demanded conformity. Mariam had always prided herself on being the head of the household. She was sharp, observant, and used to controlling every aspect of her family's life, especially Amina's. Over the past few weeks, however, something had started to feel off. Amina, the obedient daughter she'd shaped for so many years, had grown distant. She no longer eagerly participated in the wedding preparations with Kofi, the wealthy suitor Mariam had chosen for her. Instead, she had become distracted, preoccupied, and seemed to shrink further into herself. It was subtle at first, a missed glance here, a short response there, but over time, it became too apparent to ignore. Mariam watched as Amina began to withdraw, her gaze drifting when Kofi's name was mentioned. She would avoid Mariam's questions about the wedding, her answers becoming more vague and evasive. It was as if Amina were no longer present in the conversations about her future. Mariam knew her daughter well enough to sense that something was amiss. Her suspicions deepened as Amina's behaviour grew even more odd. In the evenings, she would slip away, citing a headache or some trivial excuse. Amina no longer showed the enthusiasm she once had when discussing the plans for her new life with Kofi. Instead, she seemed distant, almost distracted, her mind clearly elsewhere. The tension between them grew, and Mariam became more determined to uncover the truth. One afternoon, while Mariam was tending to the garden outside their home, she overheard a conversation that sent a chill down her spine. Amina was standing near the edge of the garden, speaking softly with someone in the distance. Mariam instinctively crouched low behind the bushes, her breath barely audible as she strained to listen. It was clear that Amina did not realize her stepmother was close by. "I can't keep lying like this, Kwame." Amina's voice was quiet, but Mariam could hear the tremble of emotion behind her words. "It's tearing me apart, but I love you. I can't marry him. I just can't." Mariam's heart skipped a beat. The voice Amina was speaking to, there was no mistaking it. It was Kwame, the poor man from the village, the one Amina had been so drawn to from the very beginning. Mariam's worst fears were coming true. Amina, her precious daughter, was not preparing for a marriage to Kofi at all. She had secretly married the poor man, the one who could offer her nothing but a life of struggle. Mariam's hands tightened into fists as a wave of anger and betrayal washed over her. She couldn't breathe. Her mind raced with thoughts of humiliation, disgrace, and the implications of Amina's actions. Amina had defied her, not just by falling in love with someone beneath their station, but by going behind her back and making a secret life with him. Mariam's thoughts turned darker as she imagined what this would mean for their status in the village. A woman marrying beneath her status, especially without the proper rituals or approval from the elders, could bring shame to the entire family. It was unthinkable, unforgivable. Mariam had heard enough. She stood up abruptly, startling a few birds in the nearby trees. The sound of rustling leaves was enough to alert Amina and Kwame that someone was near, but it was too late. Mariam stormed towards them, her face contorted with fury. "What is this?" Mariam's voice was ice cold, though it trembled with restrained rage. "What have you done, Amina?" Amina froze, her heart sinking as she turned to face her stepmother. Kwame, too, stepped back, his face pale as he understood the gravity of the situation. The moment of secrecy was over, and now the consequences of their actions loomed before them. I didn't want to hurt you, Mariam," Amina stammered, her eyes brimming with tears. "But I love him. I couldn't marry Kofi. I couldn't live a lie anymore." Mariam's expression twisted into one of utter disbelief and betrayal. She couldn't comprehend what Amina was saying. Love? She had planned every detail of Amina's future, from her marriage to Kofi to the life of luxury that awaited them. And now Amina was standing here, confessing to a secret marriage with a man who had no wealth, no status, and no future to offer. "Amina, how could you do this?" Mariam's voice cracked with anger. "How could you betray me like this? I've given you everything, every opportunity. You think I've worked so hard for you, for your future, just for you to throw it all away for this man." "I'm sorry, Mariam," Amina whispered, her voice shaking. "But I couldn't marry him. I couldn't live for you anymore. I had to follow my heart." Her words stung Mariam like a slap. "Your heart?" she repeated incredulously. "What about your family? What about our future? Do you think the village will forgive you for this? Do you think that they will look at us the same way now that you've married a man with nothing? You have brought shame upon us, Amina." The tension between them was palpable. Amina could feel her heart breaking, knowing that her stepmother's wrath was only just beginning. She had thought that Mariam might understand one day, but now, in the face of her fury, Amina realized just how deep the divide was between them. "You don't understand," Amina pleaded. "I don't want wealth. I don't want a life of luxury. I just want to be happy, Mariam. I want to live a life with love, not with someone who sees me as nothing more than a prize." Mariam's eyes darkened with fury. "You are nothing without status, Amina. You are nothing without the wealth that Kofi can bring us. You are nothing without me." Amina felt a surge of defiance. "I am more than that, Mariam. I am more than the riches you think will define me." Mariam took a step back, her gaze narrowing as she looked at her daughter. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said, her voice filled with venom. "You've made a choice that will ruin your life. You think I'm angry now. Wait until the village hears of this. Wait until they know that you've married a poor man and thrown away your future. Amina's heart twisted with sorrow. She had never wanted to hurt Mariam. She had only wanted to find a life of her own, to find happiness in a world that was not ruled by wealth and status. But it seemed that her choices had led her to a point of no return. "I'll leave if that's what it takes," Amina whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I won't regret my choice. I won't regret loving him." Mariam's eyes narrowed with a dangerous resolve. "Then leave. You are no longer my daughter. I will disown you. You have chosen your path, Amina, and it will bring nothing but misery. You will see the consequences of your actions soon enough." And with that, Mariam turned and walked away, leaving Amina standing in the middle of the clearing, her heart shattered and her future uncertain. Amina's heart ached with each passing day, but despite the pain, she could not bring herself to regret the choice she had made. When Mariam had disowned her, it felt as though a piece of her soul had been ripped away. But in that moment of loss, Amina found her strength. She knew now that she had chosen her own path, and no matter how much it hurt, she would not turn back. The consequences of her decision came swiftly. News of Amina's secret marriage spread like wildfire through the village. The once proud daughter of Mariam, the woman who had been poised to marry Kofi, now stood on the wrong side of tradition. The villagers, who had once admired her grace and beauty, now whispered behind her back, their eyes filled with judgment and disdain. She had defied the very foundation of their values, and as a result, she became an outcast in her own home. Amina was no longer welcome in the community gatherings. When she walked through the village, heads turned and hushed voices followed her. The once welcoming smiles had turned into cold glares. Women who had once shared recipes and village gossip with her now refused to acknowledge her existence. Men who had admired her from afar now looked at her as though she were a disgrace to their very traditions. Yet, despite the isolation and the stinging words that followed her wherever she went, Amina refused to break. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, knowing that her love for Kwame was a force stronger than any societal norm or expectation. The rejection from her family, from the village, only deepened her resolve. She had chosen love, and she would not let that love slip away for the sake of tradition. Kwame, too, bore the weight of their choices. His village, much smaller than Amina's, was even more tightly knit in its traditional values. The news of his marriage to Amina spread quickly, and just like in Amina's village, the reactions were harsh. People whispered behind his back. Some even went so far as to mock him openly. They wondered why he, a man of humble means, had chosen to marry a woman of higher status, a woman who had once been destined for a wealthier, more influential match. In his own village, Kwame's dignity was questioned. He was no longer seen as the proud man he once was, but as someone who had foolishly tied his future to a woman who could bring him nothing but trouble. Even his closest friends distanced themselves from him, warning him that he was making a grave mistake. They reminded him that Amina was no longer just a village girl. She was the product of a prestigious family that had once offered him opportunities. They told him that he would regret this decision, that the weight of Amina's dishonor would eventually crush him. But Kwame's resolve was unwavering. He knew what Amina's love meant to him. No amount of ridicule or judgment would make him turn away from her. As the whispers grew louder, he chose to ignore them, focusing instead on the love he shared with Amina. He stood by her side, quietly but firmly, proving his loyalty with each passing day. His love for Amina was the only thing that mattered to him now, and no matter the cost, he was willing to pay it. As time passed, Amina's situation only worsened. The village, which had once been her home, now felt like a cage. Every morning, she woke up to the sounds of gossip and whispers, the weight of her decision bearing down on her. She no longer felt the warmth of the community. Instead, she felt the cold, isolating air of rejection. Her only solace was in the quiet moments she spent with Kwame. But even those moments had begun to feel fragile. The wealthy suitor, Kofi, who had once been set to marry Amina, did not take kindly to this turn of events. As the gossip spread, so did his desire to win Amina back. He had been humiliated, his plans ruined by a woman who had chosen love over wealth. Kofi was determined to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. He began to openly pursue Amina, visiting her village and making it clear that he was still willing to marry her, regardless of the secret marriage to Kwame. His pride had been wounded, and he sought to reassert his position in the village, knowing that Amina's rejection had dealt a blow to his own status. Kofi's arrival in Amina's village was like a storm that stirred the dust and broke the fragile peace. He flaunted his wealth, his fine clothes, and the entourage that accompanied him. The villagers, who had once whispered about Amina's choice, now found themselves torn between the allure of Kofi's wealth and the stubbornness of Amina's defiance. Kofi's influence was undeniable. He could offer them a future of prosperity, and they wondered if Amina's rebellion had been worth the pain. Mariam, too, saw an opportunity to restore her own power. With Kofi's arrival, she began to see a way to mend the damage that Amina's actions had caused to their family's reputation. She started plotting, carefully positioning herself as the key figure in the struggle to undo Amina's decision. With a combination of persuasion, manipulation, and guilt, Mariam attempted to weaken Amina's resolve, reminding her of the consequences she would face if she did not return to the fold. Mariam knew that if she could convince Amina to leave Kwame and marry Kofi, she would be able to restore her own position of influence and regain the respect of the village. But Amina was resolute. She would not be swayed by Kofi's wealth or by Mariam's manipulations. Her love for Kwame had given her the strength to face the world without the crutch of wealth or status. And as Kofi's offers grew more lavish and Mariam's pressure increased, Amina held her ground. The tension between the village's divided factions grew more intense. Some supported Amina's choice, believing that love should be the deciding factor in a marriage, while others sided with Mariam, arguing that Amina had betrayed her duty to her family. Whispers filled the air as alliances were formed, and everyone waited for the inevitable moment when Amina would be forced to make a choice between her past and her future, between love and duty. But Amina had already made her choice. She had chosen love, even if it meant losing everything else. The consequences were severe, but in her heart, she knew she would never regret it. Kwame, standing beside her, was the one constant in a world that had turned against them both. Together, they faced the challenges, the isolation, and the hurt that came with their decision. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Amina knew that as long as they had each other, they could endure anything. As the days passed, Amina and Kwame's love story, once viewed as a scandal, slowly began to shift the hearts and minds of the villagers. At first, the whispers continued, loud and unforgiving, but gradually something began to change. It started with small acts of kindness, an elderly woman offering Amina a quiet smile as she passed by, a man nodding in recognition of Kwame's hard work. The village, though still hesitant, began to see the purity in the couple's devotion to one another. There were moments when the older generation, the ones who had once held fast to tradition, found themselves in quiet conversations, questioning the very values they had upheld for so long. They saw in Amina and Kwame not a rebellious couple, but two people who had chosen to be true to themselves, even if it meant going against the grain. Some began to wonder if love, after all, was more important than wealth or status, something they had never fully considered before. The shift was subtle, but it was undeniable. Amina's courage and resilience began to win over the very people who had once condemned her. Her quiet strength spoke louder than any words. Even those who had initially sided with Kofi or had stood by Mariam's side began to reassess their beliefs. They witnessed Amina's commitment to her marriage, her refusal to let go of what she knew was true in her heart. Among the most affected by this transformation was Mariam. At first, she had been consumed by anger and disappointment, unable to see past the hurt of Amina's disobedience. But as time wore on, Mariam couldn't help but watch her stepdaughter, with a mix of admiration and growing confusion. Amina's refusal to break, despite the weight of the world bearing down on her, made Mariam question her own decisions. She watched from a distance, as Amina stood tall even when the village turned its back on her. Mariam saw how Amina's love for Kwame was unwavering, how it had withstood the ridicule, the pain, and the social rejection. Slowly, her harsh judgment began to soften. Mariam's pride had always been her shield, her armor against vulnerability. And it was this very pride that had kept her from understanding the depth of Amina's feelings. But in the face of Amina's strength, something within Mariam began to change. She realized that love, real love, was not about status or wealth. It was about sacrifice, trust, and commitment. Mariam found herself alone in her thoughts one evening, watching Amina and Kwame from a distance as they worked together in the garden, laughing and sharing simple moments of joy. Amina's smile, the way she looked at Kwame with so much love, made Mariam reflect on her own life, on her own choices. For the first time, Mariam began to question whether she had been too focused on the material aspects of life, too determined to control her daughter's future according to her own vision. With this realization came a wave of guilt. Had she been too harsh on Amina? Had she stifled her daughter's happiness in pursuit of a dream that was not truly her own? Mariam was no longer sure. The walls she had so carefully built around her heart began to crumble, piece by piece. Over time, Mariam's transformation became more evident. Her once stern face softened, and her eyes, which had always carried a sharp judgment, now held a quiet respect. Though she was not yet ready to fully embrace Amina's choices, she no longer saw them as a betrayal. Slowly, the understanding that love, in its purest form, could transcend all obstacles, began to take root in her heart. Mariam's journey was far from over, but she had taken the first steps toward a transformation she had never thought possible. She had come to see that Amina's marriage, despite all its challenges, was not a rebellion. It was a testament to the power of love. Amina had chosen a path that was true to herself, and in that, Mariam began to see the courage she had long underestimated. In the end, Mariam found herself standing at a crossroads. She had spent so many years clinging to her own beliefs, her own version of what was right, but now she saw her stepdaughter in a new light. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was time for her to let go of the past and accept that love was the greatest force of all. As the seasons changed, so did the atmosphere in the village. Amina and Kwame's love, once hidden and scorned, gradually earned the respect it deserved. The village, though slow to accept change, could no longer ignore the quiet strength and dedication the couple shared. Together, they built a life that, while modest, was filled with promise and hope. Their small, humble home became a symbol of resilience, where love and hard work intertwined to create something far more valuable than wealth ever could. Amina, though still carrying the scars of rejection, began to find solace in the support of a few villagers who had once doubted her. Slowly, more people started to understand that love was not bound by material things or societal expectations. It was something deeper, something that transcended the judgments of others. Amina's happiness with Kwame became undeniable, and people began to admire the couple not for their status or riches, but for their unshakable devotion to each other. Mariam, too, began to change. She still held on to some of her old ways, her stern demeanour and the strictness she had carried for so long. But she no longer viewed Amina's marriage with anger. It was a slow process, but Mariam came to accept that Amina had chosen a path that was true to her heart. She had defied tradition, yes, but in doing so, she had found a love that was pure and unwavering. Mariam saw the strength in her stepdaughter that she had never truly appreciated before, and with that understanding came a quiet respect. Although Mariam was not yet ready to fully embrace the idea of a love-based marriage, she started to soften in her attitude. She visited Amina and Kwame more often, watching them work side by side, building their future together. She saw the joy in their eyes, the way they cared for each other with a tenderness that spoke louder than any words. It was clear to Mariam that this was not just a fleeting romance. It was a lasting bond, something worth cherishing. The village, too, began to embrace Amina and Kwame as a symbol of love overcoming adversity. While some older villagers still clung to the traditional views, the younger generation started to see them as an example of how love could defy the odds. The couple became known not for the wealth they lacked, but for the richness of their hearts. The hardships they had faced had only strengthened their bond, and in time, they became a living testament to the power of love and resilience. Amina and Kwame's story was not one of easy triumph. It had been a journey filled with pain, sacrifice, and doubt. But in the end, their love had proven that fate could be changed when one dared to follow their heart, no matter the obstacles in the way. The legacy of their secret marriage lived on in the hearts of the villagers. It was a reminder that true love was not confined to wealth, status, or tradition, but was instead built on trust, sacrifice, and the courage to defy expectations. Amina and Kwame's love had not only changed their own fates, but had also begun to transform the hearts of those around them, showing that the power of love could transcend all boundaries, even the most deeply ingrained ones. As they continued to build their life together, surrounded by the quiet hum of the village, Amina and Kwame knew that their love was a gift, a legacy they would pass on to future generations. It was a love that would inspire others to follow their hearts, to embrace the unknown, and to believe in the transformative power of love, no matter the circumstances. Their story, once hidden in the shadows, had come into the light, and it would shine for years to come.